you got to wonder how easy it's going to be for you to live in integrity, be monogamous with a flip of a switch when you decide to hang up that phase of your life and transition into a different one. And I don't think that this is necessarily given the credit that it's due, because I do think a lot of these patterns become ingrained. And I think the mentality is, oh, well, I'm not going to cheat on my wife, but I wish I could. I'm here today with Dr. Mark White, and I think this is going to be a fun conversation because Mark and I share a very similar outlook when it comes to, I'm hesitant to even say the word recovery because it's so much bigger than that. It's life. It's just having a successful, fulfilling, meaningful existence. And you and I share a similar approach in terms of a way of thinking about it. And I like this approach because I do believe that it goes very, very well with the high achievers and those in the top 2%, because their brains just, for whatever reason, gravitate towards this. And so, Mark, I'm going to open it up for you to kind of frame for us what it is that you're talking about in terms of just kind of grounding us in this philosophy before you and I move forward and apply this to sex addiction recovery.
So I just come from a perspective that we as humans, that we're designed to succeed in life. From a evolutionary biological perspective, we would say that we have in us this inborn need to connect. It's attachment, it's intimacy. A baby is born in complete connection with mom, and then he goes out in the world and cries. Okay, so the doctor places him back on his chest, and now we have peace and comfort again. And that starts the cycle of life of venture out and come back to attachment, and venture out and come back to connection. So we've got this as a part of evolutionary biology. And then we can say from a theological perspective that we've been given everything we need to succeed in life also. But as we've been given what we need, we've also been given human experience, and we sometimes kind of get sidetracked in the wilderness of that human experience that might lead us in a different direction as we try to make those connections. So from that perspective, I like to help people just discover, what do we have within us that is designing us to succeed?
And I love this because the formula that I invented, that I use in our recovery program, it's called the InDesign formula, and it's trademarked and copywritten, and I've been fabricating it over the last 7 years and improving it to this day. But it's called the InDesign formula because I share the same exact belief that you do, Mark. The concept that we are designed uniquely and perfectly, right? So your design is different from someone else. It's unique to you. But if you were to just let it do its thing, if you were to follow the desires and the motivations that you feel inherently, your definition of connection and belonging, and your desire to chase it, your definition of esteem, recognition, and admiration, the thing that you have uniquely wanted to, and the population that you want to be admired by. These things are important, and I think ignoring them is a problem, but I also think that they can be misinterpreted as well once we enter into the world. But you and I share this same piece. So I think before I want to kind of like fast forward, and then you and I can kind of come back and patch the holes in between. So I think let's fast forward to the topic of this discussion, which the men listening to this, they're high achievers with sexual porn addiction. And so, I think the elephant in the room, the question is, when we hear this concept of, hey, you've been designed perfectly, you've been designed to succeed, you've actually been designed to be fulfilled. And then here we find ourselves engaging in these compulsive sexual behaviors. Let's speak first to how this got here, and then you and I can rewind and we can kind of talk about the timeline between being born perfectly and then finding ourselves in this situation. But let's fast forward to the compulsive sexual behavior. When we're following the same thing, perfectly designed, and then now here we are engaging in these self-destructive practices. Help us wrap our head around this concept. How can this perfect being end up getting so dang confused to the point where they actually start destroying their own life?
Okay, so the perspective I take is that part of what we've been given, part of what I have within me as a 65-year-old man is that I have a natural inclination to, when I see a young woman, a sexy woman, a curvy woman, or whatever in my brain is the definition of something sexy. I've got this automatic recognition. My eyebrows raise and my head jerks over. So there is some inherent power in an attraction that my eyes would recognize, and then cognitively I would say, "Wow, there's an attractive lady." Well, I believe that many of us have become sidetracked because when we were 10 or 15 or 18 or whatever the age was, we went in that direction and we developed a paradigm of thought, a lens that said, this is something that I'm attracted to, and I go there. And now then neurons that fire together, wire together, and they get stronger and stronger. Now I've got this paradigm in my mind. Well, so many of us fall in love, we get married, we truly do love this woman, and she's great and glorious, and there's all this great experience, and she thinks there's a single reality, which is this one. But secretly, I've got this dual reality, and I go fight it for a year or 10 or 20 or 30 or more. And then I end up in this place of, what do I do with this? You know, I'm so successful at many things in life, business, and various career aspirations, and I'm successful here, and I really do love my wife, but I just can't get rid of this nagging attraction that I'm stuck on over here.
Mm-hmm. It's the way what you described is a process addiction. It's so interesting that this phrase process addiction isn't more talked about amongst sex and porn addicts, because to me, that's at the core of what's going on. And if you're not familiarizing yourself with the concept of being addicted to brain processes, you're kind of missing a lot of this piece. Because again, as you guys heard Mark talk there, notice how he didn't say that there was this addiction to sex and porn per se. He said that we become, there's this hardwiring that captures our attention. And if we enjoy that, whatever, I wouldn't say that there's any pleasure involved, but if there's some sort of desirable outcome, that somebody could potentially use that repetitively for whatever it is that they need. And so I think I'm not a fan of the word sex addiction. I'm not saying that it's not a thing. I don't think it's an accurate description of really what's going on. Of all the men who have come through our program, I haven't met a single one who I would call a sex addict. Is not addicted to sex. In fact, by the time I meet them, they've usually been sober for a month or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. And so, if they were truly addicted to sex, I think this would be more of a problem. But I think you worded it really well, Mark. It's brain processes, and I think they're all unique. And I think when you go to a 12-step meeting or you join a recovery group, you will find that a lot of the men there don't share the same exact brain process as you. Typically, if you're in a group of 10, there might be 2 guys who you're like, oh, wow, we actually have very similar brain processes. But the other guy might be engaging the same behaviors, same exact behaviors,
yes,
but with a very different brain agenda, very, very different than yours. And you won't connect per se, because you're like, well, that's not what I'm doing. But the irony is, look at the behavior choice. They're almost identical, whether it be prostitutes, anonymous sex partners. The acting out behaviors are the same. And so that's why, again, that description, I'm not a huge fan, because I think it paints a picture that I'm not sure is extremely accurate.
Yeah, and I use the term compulsive sexual behavior instead of sex addiction or porn addiction, because the addiction label just sounds too condemning, and it just kind of pigeonholes people. And there's so many varying degrees of the compulsion.
Yeah, they're what about the guy who's had, over a 20-year marriage? What about the guy who's had 4 affairs? Evenly spread out, and periods of time with no affairs. Is this guy a sex addict, a porn addict? And I agree with you. I think it's really challenging for that guy when he goes to 12-step, because he goes there because, well, where else is he going to go besides SA or SAA? Because the way that the whole, or see a CSAT, right? A set of sex addiction therapist. But I agree with you. The, expanding the category a bit and understanding that you could latch on to a wide variety of behaviors. In the case of the men listening to this, we are talking about sexual behaviors that can either prevent you from getting into a relationship or destroy a relationship that you're already in. But again, I think it's nice to take a step back here. And to me, if it's recovery is a lot more fun and a lot faster when we look at the brain processes rather than sex, porn, women, nudity. I think when we put too much focus on that, I think we miss the point. I think it's why we see such a high level of relapse in this particular addiction, is because I'm not sure treating the addiction is enough to get you sober. That makes sense.
Right. Well, I think so many programs are aimed at behavior modification.
Yeah, correct.
And we can prove in many realms of experience that behavior modification really doesn't work. But if we recognize that the behavior comes from an emotional motivation, which comes from a way of thinking, let's go deconstruct the thinking so we can discover, oh, wait a minute, that's not true.
Correct.
Here's the truth. And then let's gravitate to the truth. It's a Hebb's principle. Neurons that fire together wire together, and they get stronger and stronger. If we can say no to that and then come over here and say yes to something that's true, new neurons fire together, wire together, and we're potentially in a 90-day, so to speak, give or take some 90-day process of having a different brain.
And this takes us back to your original topic, which is human beings are wired to succeed. They're wired to get what they want. They're wired. The way I say it is, you are hardwired, designed to create the impact that you were called to create here. Right. That's how there's a change that you are called to make. And if you stay out of the way and let that kind of flow through you and listen to your emotions, you will end up in that place. And so I think when we are talking about, and I'm sharing this to kind of help reframe someone who has, maybe gotten caught up in the whole I am an addict thing. I think when we look at it and the way that you're describing, Mark, if you're hardwired to succeed, these compulsive behaviors are a part of that recipe. And I know that's really hard. It's hard to understand because it's like, well, it's destroying my life. This doesn't feel successful. And again, that's why we call it compulsive behavior, because there is a brain process that you believe is helping you. By definition, that's why I like, Mark, I like your approach of we're hardwired to succeed, because coming at this with compassion and curiosity and wondering, I wonder why my brain has decided that this is a success path. That's where we approach it, because the truth is it is succeeding at something. The question is it succeeding at keeping your family unit together, at living in integrity? It's very easy to say, hey, I'm going to go do this thing and ignore all of the other things that will be affected by that thing. It's easy to throw your water bottle out of your window so that you don't have trash in your car. But now we have a plastic water bottle sitting on the side of the road. And if everybody was doing that at mile marker 4, we would potentially have a bit of an issue. And that's really kind of coming down to this. It's, and again, I don't mean to belittle the pain that this is causing everyone, right. But I kind of do, in a sense that I think sometimes we look at it in such an amplified, rigid, destructive addict way that I think this thing becomes a very, very massive elephant in the household, when really it's a human being hardwired to succeed who's crossed their wires and is gotten themselves into a very interesting thing. And because they've done it for 20 years, that doesn't go away overnight.
Yeah. So this idea, I don't want to belittle the human experience and the pain that someone goes through, but if we take this process out of the painful reality that it's in and go academically put it into the brain science of the reality that our brains are designed to fall into patterns. Okay. Mm-hmm. Why do we do what we do? Why do we drive the way we drive? Okay. Yeah. So you're a good driver in Sedona. Okay. You've been on the road, driving on the right-hand side of the road with a left-handed steering wheel for all these years. And all of those automatic patterns of doing what you do have become so subconscious that you don't even think about it anymore. You don't think about turning your head before you change lanes. Okay, well, if we think about the brain process of patterns, that pattern has become subconscious, but that would not work very well for you if you went to Australia.
Right.
Okay, so you get to Australia, and now I've got a brain that has been successful in Sedona. Well, now I've got to stop. I got to pull that out of my subconscious mind. I got to put it in my conscious mind. I got to think about it. I got to say, no, here's the truth. And now I got to rewire my brain, the physical act, not the physical, the mental activity of renewing my mind to these things and become transformed into a driver in Australia. But we've got to do that as this intentional activity. There are placards in the sidewalk in London, England that says, look right. Because us Westerners, we're going to look left before we step off the curb. We need that conscious reminder to change our pattern.
And you, this is something that I believe, and we have a survey that we do with the men in our program. And again, it's a double blind study, blah, 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 all these fancy things to make the research valid. No, it's not. It's just, I just ask them a question and they respond, and I just collect the data for really my own purposes. But I decided to compound the data because it's like, oh, this is kind of an interesting data point. And so what I ask them is, we have these 4 different categories of where we place their compulsive behavior. We have the addictive element, right? We have societal norms, masculine norms, successful male norms. We have victim entitlement, so things like control, deception. And then we have the getting your human needs met through sex and sex appeal. So we kind of categorize these in 4 different areas so people can kind of chunk up their behavior into these different areas, because the treatment of all of them is very different. And so you don't want to throw addiction treatment when you're latched onto, a control or a deceptive issue. And so people rank it, and it's really interesting. The highest percentage, at least of the men in my group, these are high achievers, entrepreneurs, executives, professionals. The highest category, it's above, I think it's slightly below 70%, but most of them say that 68% of their compulsivity comes from societal norms and masculine norms. And that's going exactly to what you're saying is, and I think a lot of us men don't really acknowledge really what happened from 12 to 25. But if you really are honest with yourself and you remember from 12 to 25, and obviously this depends on your friend crowd and geography and where you grew up. But 12 to 25, I mean, there is just the awful lot of thinking and talking about women that goes on during that time. I mean, they become something to be conquered. They become something rare. The certain ones are rarer than others, and there's significance to conquering those, and that enhances your status when you're able to conquer someone like that. And this kind of goes on from 12 to 25, and no one really discusses this. But I mean, this is a very common thought process amongst boys, and then once you get into, 18, 19, 20, 21, college age, conquering women actually becomes quite a bit more of a focus. It is kind of for those 4 college age years, for some social groups, it's a rite of passage. It helps you know where you are in the pecking order of things, depending on who you're able to sleep with and how easy it is for someone like you to sleep with them. And again, I'm not saying this is everyone, but there's variations of this. And again, maybe you and your friends aren't talking about it, but you're, sitting in class, imagining what people look like when their clothes are off. And it's these interesting practices that, it's easy to look at and say, hey, we're sexual creatures. We have desires and needs. And it's easy to look at them and justify it and just say, hey, she's attractive. What's wrong with imagining her naked? What's wrong with trying to convince her to sleep with me? It is easy to say these things because it's been normal. It's been normalized in your cohort of social. But again, back to your point, when we're talking about rituals, habits, brain patterns, can we understand the effect? And again, I'm not talking just about your own choices. I'm talking about billboard with a woman in we saw it. My wife and I saw it. It was a cannabis delivery billboard, and it was a woman in dripping wet in a bathing suit. And my wife was just like, now, what does that have to do with cannabis delivery? Well, they know you're going to look at the billboard if they can put a woman in a bathing suit who's dripping wet. They know that that's going to get attention. So my point is, it's not just your own choices. It's also what you're seeing on television, what you're seeing in advertising. We add all of this stuff up, and let's just talk from 12 to 25. You gotta wonder how easy it's going to be for you to live in integrity, be monogamous with a flip of a switch when you decide to kind of hang up that phase of your life and transition into a different one. And I don't think that this is necessarily given the credit that it's due, because I do think a lot of these patterns become ingrained. And I think the mentality is, oh, well, I'm not going to cheat on my wife, but I wish I could. And again, how long are you going to be able to hold that together before the wrong situation presents itself in the wrong time, and you decide to kind of change your outlook on that temporarily for a day, given this person? And I think that's kind of how this whole, and again, back to why I like the description of compulsive behavior, is that person didn't look like an addict because they actually weren't acting out for those 8 years that they were with their wife, but they wanted to. And so what do you call that person? Is that person a sex addict or a porn addict, right? And again, coming full circle here, what was the objective from the 12-year-old to 25-year-old? He assessed his surroundings. He figured out what it was like to be a desirable, successful male. And then he executed on those programs without really much thought from there on out. And that's really what I think we're talking about is you're trying to succeed. And it's easy for society to say, well, this is success, because look at this music video and all these people. This is what successful men do. And again, if you don't challenge that, now here you go, boom, another brain process of I need to be in a hot tub with 8 women because that's what Jay-Z and Rick Ross and these rappers are doing. Again, are they, or is this if we take a step back, looks like a music video to me. I bet you in between takes, they're not laughing and cheersing. They're getting out of the dang hot tub and drying off and carrying on with their life. But it's so easy to remove the humanity from the situation. And the next thing you know, you're caught up in a bunch of brain processes that you've never really stopped to even register their validity.
Right. That's why I like to use the phrase sidetracked in the wilderness of life experience, because we don't intentionally learn things between 12 and 25 that sidetrack us. We unintentionally learn those things. If my granddaddy and my daddy and my uncles in my life and other important men, if they don't breathe truth into my life, I'm going to get sidetracked in the wilderness of the human experience of, using your example, watching the rap video, or, back in my day in the 70s, finding the Playboy magazine or pursuing it, or every cultural group from way back in my generation up to today, all these characteristics of what is it that defines the successful man? Well, in your example, you're saying it's the guy sitting in the hot tub with 8 women. Well, what is the 12-year-old, 15-year-old, 16-year-old learning from that experience? And not only those experiences, but so we're just now talking about the, so to speak, accidental experiences. What about young men who've been traumatized by something in their life that they didn't intend to learn also?
Yes, right, correct. And I think, and this isn't, to your point, this is not a new problem. If you look at the 10 Commandments, there's a lot of literature written thousands and thousands of years ago that speak to boundaries between you and another man's wife, right? As they're written in some of these literature. So this is not a new concept. This has been something that's been up for discussion hey, we need to be mindful of some of this stuff, because just because you want to sleep with her doesn't mean you should want to, and it doesn't mean that it's something you should do. And these are, I think, kind of coming back to the social piece of this. I think one of the challenges with this particular issue, sex and porn addiction, is what we're talking about. I think some of the challenges around this is because this isn't something that is okay to discuss in school because parents want to control it on theirs. Again, now we are and they don't want to see it on television in front of their kids either. And so now there's this big gap of discussion that's not occurring. It's occurring in the home. And I think a lot of parents are not equipped to have this conversation, not because they're stupid, but because they just simply haven't they don't even have a healthy relationship with their own sexuality. Who are they to be in a position to parent a child? But I think this void of let's just not talk about it. And again, kids aren't stupid either. That's the thing I've realized. My daughter's 5. Man, they're not stupid. I mean, they can, even if you don't say the thing, they'll pick up on it. And so I believe that in this interesting void between 12 and 18 and sex not really being discussed completely, honestly, and candidly, these kids aren't stupid. They start to pick up on, they see what they see on TV. They can understand the thing when their parents are avoiding something, they can feel it. And so I think this void isn't helping anything, because now you're kind of left on your own devices to determine the significance of all of these things. And, what 12 to 25-year-old has any business drawing any sort of conclusions around right and wrong and sexuality in that time, when their whole job is to sit back and have mentors try to help form what this means to them and coach them to find their own truth. And again, this isn't a conversation that's happening. And so it shouldn't really be that much of a mystery to find a 38-year-old male who's caught up in his career, who is, again, secretly and deceptively supplementing their sexual behavior. To me, everyone's so shocked by this. I'm not sure why they're so shocked. I can't believe that it's not happening at a higher rate than 18% of the population. I think it should be much higher than that, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I totally agree with what you're saying. And the environments that these 12 to 25s are growing up in, it's an environment where it's taboo to talk about healthy sexuality, and even to put the word healthy with sexuality. And there's some groups that don't even want to do that. I grew up in the church, and the church, that's hands off.
Yeah.
We don't talk about sex. I'm a loose cannon because I don't mind talking about it. People are kind of scared to talk to me because, I don't mind talking about healthy sexuality. And the fact that we are designed to succeed, and part of that design to succeed is to have great, fun sex. Well, church don't want to hear that. Okay?
And it is, and it's this, especially within sex and porn addiction, it's really hard to now come back to it once you've betrayed your spouse, because now it was already going to be a pretty intense issue. It's always an intense issue, in at least currently in our culture. And now you add the betrayal onto it. Oh my gosh. Now, this whole discussion of what sex is going to be in the marriage after the betrayal has happened, it's quite complicated. And so now I think there is a lot of fear on both parties. Is this going to be a sexless marriage? Can we get it back to the level that we need it to be? There's a lot of fear around that. And I think there's men and women who, do ask themselves the question of, hey, do we just wash our hands from this whole thing and go find new partners and start over so we don't have to deal with this? But my question back to you is, for people living in those areas of fear, what do you say to them? I mean, I know what my answer is typically, but I think, this is a really valid point now, because here you have this elephant in the room that has been there since you were a boy. And now you got this betrayal. My gosh, it sure seems like an impossible situation.
Yeah, I agree. And to some degree, I deal with couples where it is an impossible situation. But on the flip side, I've dealt with many couples where a partner has been betrayed, and now, he grew up 12 to 25 in his environment. Well, she was in one that was very similar. So many times, and there's nothing about me that's aiming any fault or blame at the partner of the compulsive sexual behavior man, but she and he may have had a less than glorifying sexual relationship already, because of many factors, probably those factors of growing up from 12 to 25 without good teaching on healthy sexuality. So they arrived at some point where he betrayed her. But once we once we get past the immediate trauma of the betrayal, we deal with it, we communicate in a good way, we do some reconciliation work, we work on some rebuilding trust, and we get back to that point where we can start talking about, so what are we designed for? And I've had so many women sit here with me over these last 18 years or so. And after 6 months, she'll sometimes say, you know what, I would never want to go through this again. And I would never wish this on my worst enemy. But this is the best thing that ever happened to us, because look where we are today. We would have never achieved this point of recovery if we had not gone through this tragedy and betrayal.
And I'm glad you went there, because I was going to use my own personal example, and I still will. The truth is, a lot of men struggling with compulsive sexual behavior, affairs, and all these things, a lot of them have not had sex in a way that sex can be had. And what I mean by that, and again, I didn't know what I was missing out on, because obviously I'd never experienced it. And so to me, I thought that, sex with the wife was like this, and it felt this way, and that's how it went. And then there was these other things that you can do with sex too, and it's separate. And to me, that was kind of, sex was this thing that's very interesting, and it has all these facets. But I think, to your point, my wife would say the same thing. Obviously, she wishes that this didn't happen to us, because it's arguably one of the most significant things that can happen to anyone. She's said that she's had some really awful things happen to her. She says that this is 10 times worse than any of those. Right. So this is very significant, but I think both of her and I would both say the exact same thing. It's tough to say, I wish this didn't happen now in hindsight, because the conversations and the things that we're doing and the sex we have now is real sex. I mean, it's sex amongst, I didn't know how love avoidant I was, because I'm like, oh, I'm not love avoidant. Look at all these women that I'm able to, I cry, I have feelings, blah, blah, blah. No, I was love avoidant, and I just didn't understand what love was. So I didn't really know that I was avoiding it, because I thought I was doing a wonderful job of it. Well, I was, on my own terms, in my own head, on my own conditions, under my own brain processes. But love is an exchange between two individuals. It's an unpredictable thing. It's a very unpredictable thing. It's defined differently amongst individuals. It's more of an honoring of the differences than it is around anything else. And to me, when you can engage in sex with someone in that place, both them in that place and you in that place, to me, that's a sex that I think a lot of these men have never experienced, because in order to do the things that we have to do, we have to dehumanize ourselves and dehumanize others. And so we're really not having sex with two humans when you do that. And so I think this process of rehumanizing yourself and rehumanizing the other individual, now we have something that, frankly, a lot of love avoidant men, I don't know if they want that. And I think that's why they've done what they've done. That is a very intense moment when you rehumanize yourself and another person and then have sex. That type of sex, if you couldn't have that kind of sex with another person, because it would just, by the time the humanity is re-injected into this other individual, what you're doing is, it's not attractive anymore. It's only attractive in your little story where it's like, oh, hey, I'll go do this. We'll do these positions, and then I'll go back home to my wife. We've now we dehumanized the whole process. And so I think that's what I would say to that is, for those who are scared, man, there's some sex that can be had that you haven't had, that in my opinion is better than any of the other sex that you could possibly obtain while dehumanizing the individuals.
Yeah. And see, when you use that term rehumanizing, I think that's so incredibly vital if we're going to be 65 years old and satisfied. Or what about 70 years old? Or what about 75? I'm a 65-year-old guy. I think rehumanizing and experiencing all that we're designed to succeed in is glorious. Okay. But we don't hear stories much about great sex from people who look like me. We hear it from people who look like you because of the age. Because where is that story? that you don't see old graybeards like me, testifying how great sex is.
Right. Well, the process is, again, I always, one of my quotes, I don't know if I ripped it off of somebody, but I like to think it's my own. I always tell everybody, especially my high achievers, hey, you only win the game you're playing. And if you really are honest with yourself and you look at where your attention, your time, your energy, your focus, your investment is going, a lot of the time it's going in a way, and you're winning in those capacities. The areas that you're playing the game, you're thriving and winning in those. And
Yeah.
the ones that in the game that you aren't playing, you're not winning. And so, they tend to act like it's this mystery. They're puzzled as to why they're not. And it's like, brother, you're not even attempting to play that game. And so if you're not trying, you're not going to win that game. And I think that's why recovery is such a magical experience for a lot of men, a lot of couples, is they start to play the game for fulfillment. They start to play the game for positive emotions. They start to play the game so that other individuals, other humans can experience positive emotions. And then this whole oneness thing that everyone talks about, you start to really appreciate that. Everyone's always heard of it. Everything's one, right? The trees, you always hear that. It's a really hard concept to wrap your head around. But the cool thing about recovery, when you start acknowledging the humanity in yourself and everyone else, it's this neat equality that happens. And I think for high achievers, they've spent a lot of their time avoiding the equality by being superior. And I think the challenge with trying to be better than everyone is it's very isolating. And it opens up a massive door for all sorts of addictions, not just sex and porn addiction, but compulsive behaviors of all ways: shopping addiction, gambling, an addiction to success and money. Men shop too. When we hear shopping addiction, we always think about women buying handbags. I think men are some of the worst now with the devices. They're scrolling for investment properties constantly. They're on auctions for cars, even though they're not even in the market for a car, and they're just spending hours and hours and hours wanting things. And I think if we look at how your life is going, you look like somebody who spends an awful lot of time wanting things. And so you're thriving and succeeding at wanting things. But again, it's exhausting to want. And one would argue it's also very distracting away from the life that you have.
Yeah. So when we spend a lot of time wanting, we are renewing our minds to some kind of a lust. It's lusting for properties and investments. It's for cars, or maybe it's lusting for some woman that's on a porn site or on OnlyFans, or whatever the case may be. So if we renew our minds to that becomes the pattern that we're attracted to. We're designed to succeed by being married for 50 or 60 years and having this one partner that we are in oneness. You use the word oneness, that we're in oneness with. So the perspective I take is, let's go define what oneness is. Then let's go do the activity of becoming one as a partnership in marriage. And then let's go live that as a lifestyle, not as an intervention. Because this intervention, if we don't stick with it as a lifestyle, we will have a tendency to get distracted in the wilderness of human experience.
Again, and right back to what we talked about. Again, recovery to me is intentional living and self-mastery. This concept of, to your point, of abstinence and sobriety. These are cool tools to buy you some time to recover and not hurt your wife. So use those tools, put those barriers in place that you need to, because unlike other addictions, relapsing in this addiction can end your marriage. And so, use those tools. But again, it's, recovery is intentional living. It's going back through and testing your brain processes for validity. Again, a lot of guys, they come to me, they're very defensive around sex, and, I like sex, my wife doesn't like sex, and I can't imagine a life. My comeback's the same. A lot of guys have heard me say this on other episodes. Heroin, from what I understand, I've never used it, but from what I understand, it's a heck of an experience. And you don't see a lot of these successful men using it. And so my point of that is there's a lot of wonderful things in life, but to me, and this applies especially to successful men, to me, life's about restraint. Steve Jobs has one of these quotes. Somebody asked him, "Hey, what was one of your best business ideas?" And he stops him and he re-answers it. He goes, I'm actually, or which of your best business ideas are the most proud of, was the question. And he changed the answer and he said, I'm more proud of all of the ideas I didn't execute on. And I think that was a really powerful quote, because it is, I think when you look at someone who's resourceful and driven and gets what they want, the game is more about restraint than it is about getting more. It's picking and choosing, because essentially, as for a lot of high achievers, they can kind of get whatever they want. Sometimes it takes a lot of time, but they'll get there. So then the question just is intentional living. Hey, what am I know that I know I want this, but have I really just stopped to imagine what life will be when I get this accomplished? And it's, to me, I don't think there's a ton of thought being placed into that a lot of the times. It's this compulsive more. The answer is just always more. And again, a lot of that's not these men's fault. A lot of that is growing up in America, because this place, our default's more. And advertising convinces you that you need more. But I think rather than just hitting the more button over and over and over and over and over again, I think recovery to me it's this time where, especially for successful men, it's the first time they've stopped to really ask, okay, let's say I get all of these things that I'm striving for. What will life be like? Why do I need these? And what am I giving up in the 14 years between now and then to get them? And I think that's really what we're talking about here is, how do we enjoy the moment? And then how do we just stop for a second and test a lot of these things for validity before we dive into them and live the consequences later? Because I do not think, Mark, that it's that hard to do the math on a lot of these things and see that and see the flaws. I just don't think people are stopping long enough to see the flawed thinking pattern in the first place. I think, again, they're just hitting the more button. And so they're just getting more of everything, and they're getting more of a lot of unpleasant things as well.
Yeah. Well, I like the way you put that into words, because you said that, getting what I want. Well, if we go back to where we started in this episode, talking about we are designed for success. So we have in us some inborn wants. I want connection, but I might have spent many years training myself to want this and this and this and this, and find out, oh, those things aren't near as satisfying as I thought they would be. And I'll just bring us back to that infant in complete unity with mom, the moment of birth, out here crying and screaming, and he just wants to be back in this connection. So we've got inborn DNA structured needs and wants, but yet we've trained ourselves to want something else because, to put it in your words, we just kept hitting the more button. Well, we trained our brains for more.
To me, when you stop, you start seeing the competing wants. And that's why that's the core of the reason that our recovery group works is it's a room of high achievers, and we really start mapping out all of your brain processes that are adding up to all of these. And we start to seek the ones that compete directly, because they're opposing, wanting a really magical relationship with your wife and a strong family unit, and then sleeping with a prostitute 2 or 3 times a month, and concealing that information from your wife and your family, maybe even engaging in some reckless sexual behavior from time to time. Again, isn't that competing? Isn't it a direct competitor with what we just said, with being, a lot of guys want to be admired and respected. If you had to make a timeline of all the stuff that you do and how often you did it, and you posted that on social media, don't you think that would harm the amount of people that respect you? I mean, look at what happened to Tiger Woods. It was a pretty big blow. There's a lot of people who have forgiven him, but they certainly don't look at him in the same light. And I think that's That's what I'm talking about here. And that's really how the core of our program works. Is I think you can talk about sobriety all day long. You can talk about not doing things all day long. You can put barriers in place all day long. But to me, you're not out of the woods and in the clear until you have gone through all of those brain processes and make sure that none of them are competing with what you want. Because as long as you're attached to ones that are directly threatening the life that you want, which there's a lot of them, again, I think you're going to be, I think you're signing up for a very rude awakening and a lot of disappointment when you're getting what you want and you're unknowingly harming your ability to create true connection. You're chasing admiration that means nothing to you. A lot of men, if they can buy it and they're getting admired by the thing that they bought, a lot of them don't actually feel admired or respected or noticed, because to them it's like, well, so I just went to the store and bought it. A lot of people could do that. And so I don't want attention for something that I bought. I want attention for what's inside. But then I ask him another question. Well, how are you expressing yourself in that capacity? Are you putting yourself in leadership positions and impact positions where you're allowing people to? And the answer is usually no. I mean, it's just, again, you only win the game you're playing. And if you're playing, I think if guys are really honest, the life they're getting is very much aligned with the game they're playing. And so again, they sit here and they're so dumbfounded and they feel victimized. And I get it. It is a sick game that people have been falling for. And you're a full grown adult and these are choices. I know it doesn't feel like we made these choices, but you did.
Yeah. Well, you using the words, you only win the game you're playing, and the idea about intentional living, I think that's a very good principle. But I use the term principled living because it's not just intentional,
right,
but it's thoughtful. That before we became intentional about doing these things, we stopped. And even in a oneness perspective between a husband and wife, stop and say, so what are the principles by which we're going to be intentional? What are the principles of connection, the principles of doing many things in life that would bring us the satisfaction, the admiration, the respect, those kind of things that high achievers are looking for anyway. Let's talk about it. What are those principles? And that becomes some of those principles of oneness.
Yeah, and that's a perfect place to end it. I think you said it really nicely. I think a lot of men have killed off their moral compass because they just couldn't deal with the guilt and the shame anymore. Because I think every single guy can remember the first time they did any of these things for the first time. I think every guy can remember the nasty, nasty, nasty feeling that they felt. Sometimes it was enough for them to avoid doing it. Sometimes it wasn't, and they didn't feel it until after. But every time you do something you shouldn't do for the first time, that feeling's there. And I want a lot of guys to remember that, because just because you killed it off and you're not feeling it now doesn't mean that it went away. And this is something that, to me, this is where like real sobriety starts. And it usually happens in our program right around like 90 days for the men who are really committed and lean in and do the work and actually engage. 90 days approximately, they start to actually gain that visceral response back. So when they go to, they start engaging in the ritual and they start getting closer to maybe enacting out behavior, they'll feel it. It'll start burning inside. And that, again, that uncomfortable feeling, that's your moral compass returning. And again, you never destroyed it. You just found a way to ignore it. And again, humans are hardwired to succeed. So if the goal is to not feel shame and guilt and remorse, then the goal will be to not feel shame, guilt, and remorse. And you'll probably find a way to accomplish that. Yeah. But to your point, regain that moral compass back and really operating from, a place of truth rather than a bunch of learned nonsense from societal norms. That's when sobriety comes back, because to me, truth wins every single time, in my opinion. I think when men can start feeling and seeing the truth, sobriety and recovery starts to become a lot easier, because it's when presented with the truth or something else, in my at least with our population, the men in my group, they choose truth every time. The problem is, a lot of the time, that's not an option that's being presented. It's just acting out. And so there's no truth to pick from. So they pick the acting out because, maybe the other alternatives are uncomfortable, awkward, annoying, boring. And so acting out actually looks bad. But I'm saying if we can just place the truth back in there as one of the options, and if you can get to the place where you're scanning your options and the truth is there right next to this other thing, in my opinion, the men choose the truth every single time.
Yeah. Well, someone really wise once said, "Know the truth, and the truth will set you free."
Yeah. Who was that, I wonder? Hey, Mark, thanks for your time. I already knew when we first met, this is going to be a wonderful conversation. You and I see things really eye to eye. A lot of this, we hear this concept of surrender. It really is the truth, but we're not talking about surrendering and just not caring at all. We're talking about surrendering to truth. And I think if you really tap in and we really remember, there was once a point in time in your life where you knew what was true and it was easy for you to follow it. And life is kind of unfortunately for most people, it is a path of becoming more and more astray. And here's the cool thing. You can get back. The fastest way to get back is to draw a straight line back to the truth. And I think if you have really, really good help and you're leaning in, that path can be as short as possible. Now, I don't know how far off you've gone, so it could be longer than some. So I'm not promising that it's going to be easy or rapid. But I will say, you can control how there is the shortest way to do it. And there is longer ways to do it. And in the case of this, there is an expiration date on the marriage. And so, I always advise guys, dragging your feet and waiting to make a decision on this is dangerous because there is an expiration date, and that conversation coming from the wife's always a tough one. And I've seen a lot of guys when they, and by that time straightening that path and making it shorter, it's too late for that. She wanted you to do that 4 months ago. So, hey, Mark, you have where are you licensed? I know your son is very talented at what he does as well. Where are you guys located, and in what state do people have to reside to be able to use your services?
We're located in Lubbock, Texas, Dr. White and Associates. And I have a couple of associates who are also licensed in New Mexico. And then I'm licensed in Texas, New Mexico, Montana, and Kentucky, and see clients remotely in all those locations. My son, Tim White, sees clients here in the state of Texas, but he'll be soon licensed in New Mexico as well.
Awesome. Perfect. That's cool to know. So we actually have a good wide amount of options. Hey, Mark, thanks for this. This was fun.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me.